5 tips to actually grow your fish faster. But do you even want to do that? You sure you want to do it? Because there might be some drawbacks to growing a fish faster. Let's talk about it. There's a few different reasons for probably why somebody would click on this video. Maybe there's somebody that is breeding fish. They want to make sure that it is a fast process from baby to the size of a fish that they could sell. Maybe you're interested in your fish developing, growing faster so that they can be ready to breed sooner so that you can also do that same thing. Or maybe you just have a fish that is supposed to get really big. You want it to get really big faster so that you can have that instant gratification. I get it, there's a lot of reasons for wanting to at least know how to do it, but it might not be the best thing for your fish, and we'll talk about that, but let's hit the tips first. The first one is super boring and straightforward. It's just water temperature. If a fish is in warmer water, it's gonna be able to digest food faster. A lot of fish naturally will go through growth spurts during the warm season or when the water around them is warmer, so it's kind of almost like an evolutionary thing. And if you want to take advantage of that, you can just keep them at a higher temp. But then in lies the question, what is a higher temp, right? Everybody keeps their aquariums at different temperatures. There's the default sort of like recommended, hey, if you have a tropical aquarium with freshwater fish, keep it at 78 degrees or whatever. I keep my tanks lower than that. They're at like 74 maybe. I know people that keep their tanks at 71, 70, maybe even, don't tell anybody, 69 degrees. Every fish is gonna be different, and every fish is gonna have a different like window that they wanna exist in or be optimal within. But generally speaking, a fish that you keep in the mid 80s is probably gonna grow faster than a fish that you keep in the mid or low 70s. Food is also gonna tie into this temperature thing, but just know that even keeping fish permanently at higher temperatures is something that is most likely going to shorten their lifespan. There's too many fish out there to just make these big blanket statements like that, but generally speaking, that's what you're going to experience with higher temps. Second tip is protein. Protein is super important because that's what fish use to grow. That's how they go anabolic. When it comes to fish and most other developing animals for that matter, you use protein for primarily growth, fat for energy and maintenance, and also carbs for energy and maintenance. Protein can also be used for energy, but it's not like the ideal pathway biochemically in the fish. So by definition, feeding a higher protein food is just gonna result in a fish being able to grow more or faster. Most fish foods are gonna have between 40 and 50% protein. That's sort of like a general thing that you're gonna see. Certain foods are gonna have less protein, but those are typically, you're gonna see like a sinking pellet be that way because they're marketed for like algae eaters, even though that's kind of just a marketing thing. Most foods are gonna sit in the 40 to 50% protein range. That's a good balanced amount of protein for something that's an omnivore, which most of our fish are. There's always gonna be exceptions, but when it comes down to it, you're feeding baby fish, you're trying to get them to grow as fast as possible, you're gonna wanna feed them just something with more protein. They're gonna grow faster with a food that has 60% protein than if they were to eat a food with 40%. 60% might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but you're probably gonna see close to 50% for most of these fry foods, which is still definitely considered a high protein food. So now we hit the third tip. This is just gonna be frequency and the amount of food that you're feeding. The two previous things we talked about, temperature and protein, kind of meet the trifecta with this one, and here's where things can get a little weird. So let's say you have the temperature high, the fish is able to digest things really quick, enzymes are working properly within the fish, so you can sprinkle in like 6 feedings a day, and you're able to put in more food each time. Now you get into the realm of, are you feeding your fish too much? If you're trying to push the limits, if you're truly turbo feeding your fish, is that a good thing? Do you want to be doing that? Because there's consequences to everything. So the more food you put in the tank, regardless of if the fish are eating it, even if they're eating most of it and not a lot of it is being wasted at the bottom, you're still gonna be polluting the water more, you're gonna have nitrogen buildup more, and depending on the fish and the filtration setup and just everything about your setup, you might be having to do a crazy amount of water changes. You might actually overload your filtration and have an ammonia spike. All of that metabolism going on is gonna put a really big demand on oxygen, so you might have to start running extra air stones so your fish don't suffocate. There's definitely some risk involved with this, and you wanna know what you're doing before you attempt it. The amount of food that they can eat is also important. So when it comes to different fish, you're going to experience different things with different types of food. Some fish are going to be able to eat the heck out of this type of food, whereas other fish just don't seem to be super interested in it. So finding a food that works for whatever fish you're trying to grow fast is really important. That's why something like live brine shrimp is so popular, because fish A, pretty much all fish, can eat the heck out of that. Guppies can actually get to the point where if you just keep feeding them, they'll keep eating and their stomachs can actually explode, which is kind of freaky. I don't want to think about that. I would never get anywhere close to that, but that I think just puts it into perspective. So if you're trying to sit somewhere in the middle, like you're trying to responsibly grow your fish, you want to find something that they can eat a decent amount of, and just observe your fish. Watch out for signs of things like bloat. If they're looking like they're having trouble digesting, then back off the food a little or feed a little bit less. Overfeeding your fish can cause other health problems too, like fatty liver disease. So that's just another reason why I choose not to do it. And this is actually one of the reasons why I don't really recommend legit fish food for growing baby fish as fast as possible. But if you just want them to grow at a healthy rate, I think it's a good choice. The reason why it's not going to be good for growing them as fast as possible is because fish just can't stuff their faces with it all day. At least for guppies. That's the only experiments that I've done looking at this so far, but we can't say for sure because those still aren't done yet. Here's an analogy for you. So this bag of popcorners, if I crack this open, I could eat this entire bag. That's because it's a super processed, not very nutrient dense food. If this bag of popcorners was instead filled with steak bites and broccoli, I could probably only eat a quarter of it before I got full. That's basically what our pellets are, a super nutrient dense food that's not over processed, so it's just tough for a fish to sit there and gorge on it all day. This makes it a really good overall food for pretty much all of your fish. It's just not optimized for crazy fast growth. It's more of a health / promotes breeding type of food if I had to categorize it. And because it's so digestible and clean, when it comes out of your fish, there's gonna be less in that material to contribute to potential problems. And I think eventually we will have a food that's tailored for growing up fry with a little bit more protein, try and get past that portion of it. But one food can't do everything that you want it to do. Nothing is perfect. When you do all three of these things to get your fish to grow faster, and they definitely will if you do it, what's the cost for that? There's gonna be consequences. How much shorter is their lifespan gonna be? I don't think anybody can tell you an exact answer on that, because frankly, I don't think anybody has really studied this portion of the hobby too much. So it's impossible to say that if you turbo feed fish at 86 degrees Fahrenheit for a year straight, if that's gonna take off 20% of its life. Maybe it's only 5% of its life. I think the moral of the story is that it is going to impact the longevity of your fish. How much? I don't think we know that. I learned a lot over just like the last 6 months of breeding up my rice fish and breeding guppies, and that's something that I've kind of been cognizant of. Like, do I want to do that? For me personally, it was no. So I haven't been turbo feeding my fish. I haven't been keeping them at super high temperatures. And the result is that they've been growing a little bit slower than they could. All this stuff is so connected. So it's gonna lead us into the fourth thing, which is just water quality. So I think I already kind of touched on it, right? Like if you're feeding a lot and your fish are growing and you have a bunch of fish, you're gonna pollute the water faster. So you're gonna have to do more water changes to reduce that amount of nitrate, to prevent any kind of ammonia spikes, because you're feeding so much, you're overloading your nitrous amonis bacteria. You know, it's just one of those things where all of these things factor into slowing down a fish's growth because it's not in an optimal environment. And that's why I think a lot of breeders would tell you that they experience fish continuing to grow at a normal rate when they do regular water changes, because that water quality is just so important. It's getting hot in here without the dehumidifier. We're almost wrapping up before we get to the caveats, but this last one, number 5, is gonna be just having green water. You definitely don't wanna have green water in your display tank, but if it's in a tank where you're breeding small fish, it's actually a super nice thing to have. There's been a decent amount of research on green water, and it's shown that fish are able to actively and passively uptake nutrients from the algae suspended in the water. It does a whole range of other things like prevent nasty or bad bacteria from taking over because that algae is populating so much space. It also makes the fish way more chill. Like, there's a bunch of really cool things about it, on top of the fact that it is a huge nutrient suck. So that green water has to thrive and live somehow, and it's feeding off of all the nitrogen and the other waste that your fish are producing. So you can have a really cool setup with nice green water where you don't really have to do as many water changes because that green water is just making it a self-sustaining little fry growing ecosystem. I think that's really cool. Here's an example of a green water setup that I have going on right now. So we have a handful of guppies in here. Haven't changed the water in these for several weeks. Let's do a test strip just to show you guys. So despite having, several guppies in that small volume of water, no nitrite, no nitrate, there's also no ammonia. The green water just does what the green water does and consume all of those bad things that we don't want to accumulate in the water. So I'm a big fan of green water. Obviously, if you have an aquascape, you don't want it, but if you're breeding fish, it's a really cool thing to have. And what's even weirder is that in my 10 plus years of having fish tanks in my house, never had green water before in soft water conditions. It was only until I started making the guppy water and boosting the hardness, also having tanks where I don't have like a substrate and like a mature ecosystem that I'm trying to build out, that I finally then started to get green water every once in a while. So I'm kind of thinking that green water is at least promoted in tanks that have an excess of minerals, so hard water. Don't quote me on that, I don't know for sure, but it seems to be at least part of the story. So those are the tips for growing fish faster. I hope we kind of already touched on the biggest caveat, which is just the life expectancy, the health of your fish. If you're stuffing your fish with a ton of food, it might not have the outcome that you want. You might be trying to get a fish to grow, it might grow really big, but then it might not live very long. So like, I'm not here to be the moral fish police or anything. You should do what you want to do. I think most people just want to have healthy fish that live as close to a normal lifespan as possible in captivity, obviously. But there's always going to be the people that want to know how, maybe they just want to know how breeders or people might be doing it, hence why I'm making this video. So fast isn't always better, and there's some drawbacks to that. The second thing is just genetics. So if you get a spawn of guppies, you get a birth of them, and you have 20 fish, you might only end up with like 15 of them looking like they're in good shape, depending on how inbred they are. You're gonna have runts, you're gonna have fish that it looks like they're keeping up, but then at 3 months, then you start to see a little size discrepancy between them. And genetics is just that thing that you can't know about until you know about it. Some fish just aren't gonna be as big as others, some fish aren't gonna be as healthy as others, some fish aren't gonna live as long as others. So genetics is that thing that you can't control, you get what you get. Here's a good example of genetics, and specifically genetics between different fish species. So in here we have 2 different types of fish. We have the rice fish, you're gonna see those up at the top here. And then we have some minnows that are much larger down at the bottom. Let's try and get them up to the top so maybe we can see them a little better. My minnows aren't coming up to eat, but you can see them there down at the bottom. And if you can imagine, they're farther away than the rice fish. They're probably at least twice the size of the rice fish, even though all of these fish were born basically in the same month. There might be a few days difference even with just the rice fish, but even they have a significant size difference between them, right? So genetics, that's just a thing. Definitely between species of fish, you're gonna notice a difference. Some are just gonna grow faster than others. And then even within the same batch, you're gonna have some subtle size differences or even some dramatic ones. And I think it all just ties back to be patient. I don't think there's any reason for you to want your fish to grow as fast as possible all the time. Maybe right when you get your fry, you want them to grow to a certain point because you have a goal, and I think that's totally fine. But just keep it in the back of your mind that maybe it's probably something you shouldn't do for forever or as long as possible, because there are drawbacks to that. Every fish is different. I hope this video helped you find what you were looking for. Thank you guys for watching, and if you want to try a really healthy, awesome fish food, try legit fish food. This bag of fish food says no added hormones, and my question is, do other fish foods have hormones in them? Thanks guys, and we'll see you in the next one.